Thanks, Ollie, and hopefully you can now see my screen and even hear me as well. Good, brilliant. Well, it's brilliant to be, well, quite exciting, quite an honour, a little bit daunting to be first in this new series, but it's a real pleasure to have been part of the team that's been thinking about what this seminar series can do and the discussions that we can create around it. And just to start with, I'd like to echo quite a lot of the things that Ollie touched on. In fact, actually, to just sort of to touch on the question you said about experts is actually, I'd like to say, I think I'm coming from a point of humility here too, is that I'm not an expert. I think we're all at different stages in our sort of understanding around decolonisation. We all have different perspectives and it affects us, the issues affect us in different ways. So I suppose, you know, I'm learning, and I think we're all learning too, and hopefully this will sort of help us sort of understand some issues, and I'm really interested in what you folks have got to say about it. I think carefully about how I choose my words, but I don't always get them right. And, you know, as Ollie says, these are difficult and sometimes quite distressing and quite potentially offensive issues that we're talking about. So I'm sort of working from the point of trying to do it better. And then just to say, the picture you see, I put that on the picture you see there, that little sort of picture in the corner of the screen. In one of those sort of lockdown scenarios, I managed to set lights in a notebook, sort of thing that I don't quite know how it happens. And in sort of salvaging it, using my best museum salvage techniques, I found that the page that burnt was the decolonising Cedric page. And I thought it sort of made me, if nothing, I sort of quite liked it, it made me laugh. But it made me sort of think, remind me that I want to say this isn't about destroying the museum. This isn't about sort of tearing down an amazing museum, but what it is about making it do its job better, and about telling the whole story around the museum, and not just perhaps these stories that we have selectively told in the past. So let's start. I mean, I think a lot of this seminar is about stepping back and thinking about the bigger picture and looking in on our subject. And to be just kicking off, what do we mean by decolonisation? And I'm sure there are some of you that are really familiar, have been doing a lot of reading around it, some of you perhaps less so. And, you know, we're all coming to this as perhaps in different ways. What we've got here in the Cedric, in the museum, is we've got a really important scientific collection. It's a really data set, or a whole set of data sets, but it's not just a data set. People don't come to the museum just to see our data. They come to see beautiful objects, they come to see interesting objects, they come to have stories told about them. And those stories might be the wonder chicken, they might be around the structure of the deep earth, they might be around collectors, they might be around people, they might be around fieldwork, they might be around the paleontology or the geology. But it's around stories, and it's recognizing, and this is beyond just the sort of the decolonisation element, recognizing that the museums, what we tell in the museum, it's a selective story. Whose stories get told? There's a cultural context to decide what are the messages that come through. And it's a piece of work that we've been doing in the Cedric over the last years, recognizing that we're perhaps quite selective, that there are hidden stories, ones we don't know about. And sort of we're committed to try and address that, and that's expressed in our new exhibitions policies under the sort of the phrase diversifying the museum voice, recognizing there are different ways to frame the information that we share. And so you may already be aware we've been doing quite a lot of work uncovering stories of the early women geologists that are told through our archive. We've been looking into the stories of LGBTQ people who've contributed to our museum and expressing them through tours. And our Hand That Rocks feminist tour has also told some of those as well. So it's a way of saying there are different ways to frame this. And of course, one of the ways in which the museum story is skewed most substantially is the legacy of empire and colonialism. And I've given you a couple of quotes there from what I think is a really important paper by Subhadra Das from UCL and Miranda Lowe, who's a curator at the Natural History Museum. Which incidentally, if you want to follow, I put the references in a paper on Teams, and I can post them to other places too. But it's recognizing that the history of science, but also of our earth science, from Enlightenment through the 18th and 19th centuries, goes hand in hand with the development of the Industrial Revolution and the expansion of empire, not just the British Empire, but European empires. And central to that development and that expansion was the slave trade and the wealth accumulated by what were overwhelmingly white European people based on the work carried out by black people, black enslaved people in the Caribbean, in the US and elsewhere. That slave trade enabled the accumulation of wealth and enabled those things to happen, enabled people to travel, enabled them to have the wealth to sit and think and reflect and expand their science. And that's not a story that we feel particularly comfortable telling. And just going back to what I said at the beginning, this isn't about tearing up the museum and saying there's nothing good in it. But what we do need to do is acknowledge that there are wrongs and there are difficult stories and commit to telling that whole story. And I think we have a duty to do that as professionals, as museum professionals and scientists, but also we have a duty to our public audiences. And there's really clear evidence, both we have in the museum staff from our audiences telling us, but there's studies been done that tell us quite clearly that Black and minority ethnic people feel alienated from many museums. They feel they're not telling their stories. My question is then, my challenge is then, how can the public trust us if we don't acknowledge that history? So what I'm going to do today is talk through, I think, 5 of the key objects, some key objects or key themes from the museum. And they're really high profile things, and I'm sort of doing that because I want you to understand we don't have to dig very far to find some difficult stories. We really don't at all. And I'm only going to just touch on them quite lightly. I could talk for hours about each of them probably, as could my team. And at this point I want to acknowledge the input that this is a team effort. The museum team have contributed enormously to this, and I've particularly, all of them have particularly mentioned Rob Theodore, who's our exhibitions coordinator, Douglas Palmer, Dan Pemberton, and Sandra Freshney, who's our archivist. I'd also say that as Cambridge University Museum, we're part of a consortium of university museums in Cambridge, and the consortium team, the UCM team, and also the funding that we receive from the Arts Council has supported quite a lot of this work that we've been doing, and I'll talk a little bit about things we're doing at the end. So I want to acknowledge all that, and I think it's also appropriate really to take a moment just to acknowledge the contributions of all those unnamed and unknown Black people and people of colour who have contributed to our collections. And I hope what I'm talking about today can help you see how what that role that they have played. So let's, in the words of an important philosopher, let's start at the very beginning. Well, the Adam Sedgwick beginning. Anyway, so we are the Sedgwick Memorial Museum, opened in 1904. In recognition of the sort of the life and the works of Adam Cedric, who died in 1873. And I won't talk at great length about his geological achievements, but he was absolutely central to that sort of heroic Victorian age, heroic in inverted commas, Victorian age of the development of geology, about defining the Cambrian, the Devonian, the Lower Paleozoic, can't get the words out. He taught and mentored Darwin, so showed him the sort of the field skills needed for that to prove to be so incredibly useful on his voyage. He played an enormous role in administration in the university, in the development of the Philosophical Society. So he was a really big figure in the university. And I've put a quote here. We have his quite extensive letters and writings. This is a quote from him, sort of writing in sort of fairly old age, reflecting back, sort of rather florid language. About his feelings about abolition, the campaign led by William Wilberforce to abolish the slave trade, which was successful in the early 1800s. So he saw himself as an abolitionist, and that's very much sort of part of the society that he moved in. They saw themselves as abolitionists. But dig a little bit deeper, and you don't have to go very far. And I'm using as a resource here, there's a fantastic resource from UCL about the legacies of British slave ownership. And again, I've posted the link to that on the further action page because you might like to look up all sorts of people in it. We find that in 1836, Adam Sedgwick was the co-beneficiary of the will of an Anne Sill of Dentdale. Now, those of you that know the Sedgwick story know that Cedric was very much a sort of local boy in Dent in the Dales. He would have known Anne Sill. Her family had owned plantations in Jamaica for several generations, and on the wealth that they gained from that, they bought up quite a lot of land. So she was quite, her family was sort of quite a family of quite standing in Dent. And they had, you know, gained quite a lot of money from the plantations that they had, the sugar plantations in Jamaica. And, you know, it's rather sort of gutting to realise this, that although the slave trade was abolished in 1808, slavery itself continued and until 1836, when certainly in Jamaica and uprisings in the Caribbean islands finally led to the ceasing of slavery. And what happened then? So the government compensated, but who did they compensate? Did they compensate the freed slaves? No, they compensated the slave owners. So Anne Sill, who had owned 174 enslaved people, was compensated the total of £3,783. And she made her claim and I think died before the claim went through, and the claim was picked up by Cedric and the money came to him. And when I put that figure into the Bank of England inflation calculator, that is nearly £500,000 in today's money. So that's a really substantial amount of money that came to him. And you know, I think then you can see how that quote that he writes at about that time, for the first time in my life, I am to be well paid for my work. So what happened to that money? Well, we don't know. And there's a big piece of work that I'd like to do now, is to find out what happens. But what we do know, that he was buying specimens. We know that he, over the next 10 years, he bought a number of specimens from Mary Anning in Dorset. And those are some of the really important, quite sort of iconic, scientifically and historically important specimens that we have. So we don't know exactly what money went where, but £500,000 isn't going to sort of, it makes quite a substantial difference if you're interested in buying fossils. And I think it's not unfair to say that some of the sort of the key, the heart of our collection would have come about in that time. Cedric was a very prolific collector and really built up the collections. So, moving just slightly on, moving on from Mary Anning, I'm going to talk a little bit about Henry de la Beach, and that image, which, depending on how big your screen is, that image in the top right, it's a bit small on mine. That is one of the specimens that Cedric bought off Anning in the 1840s, I think. And you may not be able to see it, but this is an interesting little aside. This is where the sort of the intersection of class and gender also come into the story. Although he bought it off Mary Anning, she's not at all acknowledged anywhere publicly. And on that specimen, it actually says presented by Professor Cedric. So he gets the credit there. Anyway, I'm hoping that you know, Mary Anning was a fossil collector, a working class woman working in Lyme Regis in the early part of the 19th century, making a living from collecting fossils and selling them to people such as Cedric, to Buckland in Oxford, Natural History Museum and others. And, you know, not only was she an excellent collector, she really knew her stuff, but she sort of continuously was on hard times. And Henry de la Beach was a good friend of hers and supported her a number of times with money. But in particular, in 1830, he was a, you know, sort of enjoyed drawing. He drew this sort of groundbreaking sketch, Duria Antiquor, showing ancient Dorsetshire, based on the fossils that she had found. And we don't have an original of that in the museum, but we do have a much larger format painting up on the wall in the Jurassic area, which is the one on the right, which was a painting commissioned by Cedric, a copy by the painter Robert Farron, which I assume that Cedric used for teaching. I'm just going to have a drink from my Duria Antiquor mug briefly now. And we'll also, as an aside, mention, if you're on social media, the museum is running a fabulous summer holiday campaign launch today, making your own ammonites and belemnites. Please do join in. Okay, so that's the happy bit of the story. Where did he get the money to support Mary Anning from? Well, he was much closer to the slave trade than even Cedric was. He had inherited slave plantation in Jamaica from his family. Incidentally, it was his father that was called Henry de la Beach, spelt like beech, the beech tree. And they'd obviously had a bit of an affectation, and that generation added in the de la Beach and spelt it in that sort of Frenchy way to, you know, look a bit more cool. And de la Beach had a regular income from this plantation, but also in 1823 spent a year there. So he really did know what was happening. And he, you know, this is a drawing that he made of the slaves on his plantation, and he published a little booklet around the present condition of the slaves. And he describes in quite sort of almost sort of scientific description about the sort of their lives. I mean, it's a fascinating document, but he doesn't go as far to sort of accept that this might not be the sort of the wrongs of this situation, and clearly feels quite cautious and quite concerned about it, the income. So again, there's another slave connection there. Ironically, again, in the Caribbean slave revolts in the 1830s, when slavery was abolished in Jamaica, at the time his estate was mortgaged. He didn't actually receive the compensation, and he then suffered this loss of this regular income that he'd had. And that's the point in which he petitioned the government to essentially give him a salary, and he became the first employee of what became the Geological Survey. And, you know, the rest is history there. I'm going to briefly also now just talk about Charles Darwin. Again, I'm sort of focusing on some of the iconic collections because I want to try and sort of show, I say, that we don't have to look far to find the legacies of empire, the legacies of colonialism. And Darwin's Beagle collection, I mean, it's a fantastic collection, and this is, you know, really important collection, sort of outlining the work that he did. I'm sorry, they're not actually the best photographs of him, but that's a sort of lockdown caveat there. Although the little one in the middle with the BA on it, why I like those little bivalves is that is Darwin's hand, BA meaning for Buenos Aires, where he found them. So fantastic display, which if you haven't seen, you will come and see as soon as we are open in September. But what was the purpose of the voyage? Well, it wasn't a scientific voyage. Darwin went along as a gentleman's companion for Fitzroy, the captain, so that he didn't have to talk to the plebs. He had someone nice to dine with. And in fact, this was the second voyage of the Beagle. That Fitzroy had previously, a few years previously, been on a similar trip, and it was about surveying, carrying out hydrographic surveys of South American coasts, producing better nautical charts, ultimately about enabling greater British access and control of those areas. That's what it was about. So it was part of that sort of colonial enterprise. It wasn't necessarily an aggressive act or overtly aggressive act, but it was about a certain control. And I think the other thing to say about that is that on the first voyage, Fitzroy had kidnapped, I think, 4 indigenous people from Tierra del Fuego and had taken them back to Britain, supposedly to civilize them, to teach them English and to train them to be Christian missionaries. And on this voyage, the one that Darwin was on, they were taking them back to Tierra del Fuego in the company of a missionary to set up a mission, which ultimately was unsuccessful. But again, I think that demonstrates that this whole enterprise, you know, that the work that Darwin does carried out in this context of that colonial enterprise. Okay. Now, talking of iconic objects, here's a pretty iconic one. On the off chance some of you haven't been in the museum, I can hardly think that's possible. You may have missed this. It's our largest object. It's our most popular object. It's in the entrance. Every child's oohs and ahs has their selfie taken in front of it. It's on our logo. It's on our T-shirts. The picture in the bottom corner is a family doing one of our family boxes, learning about dinosaur stride length based on that. The Iguanodon is very cool. And as I've shown with the paper, the monograph there, really important around the work David Norman did. It's one of the earliest complete dinosaur skeletons, and he did some really important work on its gait and its posture and how it was mounted in what's not the natural pose. So it's a really, really important fossil for lots of reasons, and you know, I think many of you who will have been taught by David around this object. It's a cast. It comes from Belgium. It's a cast of one of a whole number of iguanodons that were found in the 1870s in a quarry. So in itself, it doesn't have, it hasn't come from a colonial source. But what I think is really interesting about this is how it came to us. And I've put this in here. So this is the original label, and also a quote from the museum's Lecturum Syndicate. And I put that in partly because actually it went to zoology first, but fortunately they obviously struggled to find room for it. And about 10 years later, they spotted over the road there was a brand new, lovely museum and sort of sent it over to the Cedric. I love the idea that it got carried over the road. I don't know what happened. But it was given to the university, to us, by Leopold II, King of the Belgians. Now that might ring some alarm bells in some of your minds, it may not. Certainly I hadn't quite realised the depths of the awfulness until I started reading about him. So in the 1860s or so, part of what was called the Scramble for Africa, when all the European states were sort of grabbing territories in Africa, they'd recognised there were fantastic resources to be had there. King Leopold, he appropriated about 2.5 million square kilometres of Central Africa, of land that belonged to the Congo people. And he sort of appropriated it on the grounds, this sort of vast quantity of ground, on the grounds that he was carrying out. He was already involved in what he called humanitarian and philanthropic work. He had missionaries there. Not only did he claim it, but he claimed it for himself. He didn't claim it for his country. He didn't claim it for Belgium. He made himself the personal ruler of this vast state that he called the Congo Free State. And then proceeded from the 1885s onwards to extract huge quantities of natural resources from it, predominantly rubber, but also ivory, and I think quite a lot of minerals. Certainly there's a lot of mineral wealth there, and I'm sure many of you know that more about that than I do. And he was extracting huge amounts of valuable resources by systems of forced labour and violent coercion, enforced by European administrators and sort of subcontracted with concessions granted to private companies with no judicial interference. And it's estimated that the violence and the forced labour resulted in the death of between 10 and 15 million people over that period between 1885 and 1908. Deaths through shocking atrocities, through epidemics, disease, malnutrition. And it's estimated, although there aren't clear records, it's estimated that the population of the Congo was reduced by half during that time. So it's a sort of shocking genocide going on in Central Africa, perpetrated by Leopold, who actually never visited, but his agents, and extracting huge quantities of money from the people and the land. If you've read Joseph Conrad's Heart of Darkness, Conrad was a steamer captain on the Congo River, and he published his book in 1899 about his experiences. And so about when this came into the university, 1896, 1897, this is the point there was just beginning to be a little bit of suspicion that actually Leopold, who was a bit of a PR whiz, all was not good and humanitarian and philanthropic in the Congo Free State. And particularly there was a guy called Edmund Morel, who was working with a shipping company, travelled to Belgium, noticed that the ships came in loaded with rubber, but didn't go back with goods loaded for trade. They went back loaded with arms, with guns, and with shackles. And so his observations were the start of a major campaign. And it's around that time that, that support was perhaps a little equivocal for Leopold. So I'm afraid I can't help but put this dinosaur, this gift of this dinosaur, into its bigger context. It's one of a number that were given to museums across Europe. We know that Oxford has one, and London have one, Paris has one. There may well be more, and again, I've got more work to do there. I can't help thinking that this was a bit of a bury the bad news. Let's give those people a lovely big dinosaur that they'll be pleased with, to show off this thing. A sort of dinosaur diplomacy. I don't think it was just a sort of innocent act of generosity. I think there was a motive. I think it's quite likely there's a motive in there too. And I think that's a story that we'd really like to be telling there, that perhaps isn't seen at all. Okay, So finally, the last collection that I'd just like to talk in a little bit of detail about is this Watson building stone collection and the Museum of Economic Geology, which you perhaps may know by its alternate title, The Coffee Room. So John Watson, it's on loan to you, that room. We may want it back sometime, she says optimistically. No. John Watson was into cement and building stones. He sort of retired to Cambridge and spent the last sort of 15, 20 years of his life amassing this really amazing collection. So it's a sort of a fixed collection in time. It's not one that we add to, it was just collected. It presents this amazing snapshot of these sort of 2,500 specimens. And again, Nigel can tell you much more about that, particularly the local material. There's a fantastic selection of local material. But this collection represents a sort of snapshot of the building stones that built the world. These are the sort of the stones of empire and the countries that Britain was trading with. And of course, you're, I suspect, very familiar with this uncomfortable specimens of colonial and foreign building stones. That's how they were categorized. And I mean, I think there's lots to think about these collections. When I look at the catalogue, and the catalogue's online, it's the building stones that built these empires. The catalogue references how a particular building stone was used to build the governor's residence, the government building, the police station, and indeed to memorialise some of those heroes of empire. There's quite a lot of description about the grey biotite granite from a quarry near Cape Town that was used in the plinth of Cecil Rhodes Memorial at Devil's Peak. So it is sort of showing us how things were at that time. And for me, what I find is sort of fascinating and intriguing is for every one of those quarries, there's a whole community of people. And quarry workers, they're working class people, both in this country and abroad. They're not people we see pictures of very often. We certainly hardly ever know their names. So this picture that I've shown you here is actually quite an unusual one, is that we have it, and I've included it partly because it links back to what I was saying about the Congo. So this picture was taken in 1905 in Boma. And so these people would be experiencing that Congo Free State that I was talking about. As a sort of galling aside, I've known about this picture for quite a long time, and I was Googling to try and find it a week or so ago, and I came across it on a London-based picture library, and they were selling jigsaws of it, 500-piece jigsaws of it. I didn't know whether to sort of laugh or cry, really. But there's a serious point here, is that these are stories that we don't see, and each and every one of those rocks, there are stories about quarrying, and quarrying today is a pretty difficult business. There is still quite a lot of unregulated forced labour, child labour going on in quarries around the world. And I think there's a lot of stories that we could be telling and could be exploring about what those quarries are now and what they were then. So I've talked about 5 things. There's loads more. There's loads more. And I'm sort of hoping that you folks may have suggestions of other things to explore in through the museum. I've listed some of the things that we as a team have been talking about and have been able to explore a little bit. But there are, through our archives and through our collections. And also, as you see, sort of related to this, looking at how Black people and people of colour are represented in our collections. And this is a photograph that Sandra Freshney, our archivist, found from a Cedric Club field trip in 1903 to Port Maddock. And we don't know who this man is. We're trying to, despite the remarkable records of the Cedric Club, we haven't yet worked out who he is. So there's lots and lots of potential, I think. So to draw together some themes, because I want to make sure there's a bit of time for discussion, I think the questions that we ask ourselves around the collections are these. Where and how were the objects acquired? Who collected them? Where did the money come from? How have they been used in the way that, for example, I think the Iguanodon may have been used? And whose stories are we telling? Are we uncovering the stories of the peoples whose stories have not been told? This drawer, incidentally, is from our founding collection of John Woodward. It's the gold specimens from it. And I don't know anything actually about it other than that picture really, but you know, for me, each of those specimens tells a story about gold extraction from around the world, and I think there's a lot to be explored there. So how do we tell those stories? What do we do with these things? Well, in other circumstances, I'd be telling you about all our lovely new labelling and all the lovely new tours that we've been doing in the Cedric Museum, but of course we're in lockdown, aren't we? We have been for too long. But, so we've had a bit of a rethink, and I think we're really keen to get going with sort of work in the gallery as soon as we can get back in there. But I'm just going to tell you quickly about two projects that have been going on through lockdown. And the first one is led by Rob Theodore, who's our exhibitions coordinator. And Rob's been running the Community Cabinet project for 5 or 6 years now. It's down on the left, if you cut it in the gallery, down in the Pliocene, amongst the Pliocene. And it's a way in which we use one of the cabinets to display not our material, but material collected by our visitors. And there's been small groups have done displays. We've had a couple of kids have done displays, keen fossil collectors, students done displays. And Rob's been working through lockdown with a family with 2 lads who've been collecting fossils from Africa. And we're really proud that that exhibition, and it's going to go online and then hopefully in the gallery at a later stage. So all the key contributors to that exhibition will be Black British for the first time in our museum. And this will be the first time, remarkably, that post-colonial material from Africa has been displayed. Pretty much all our material originates from colonial travelling. And I just put the draft text, this is a work in progress, but this is the draft text that Rob has been working with the young lads to write the text. It's a co-curated thing, they work together. So these are their words. And that display online and in the gallery will reflect their collections and their words. So the other project to mention is the Museum Remix, which is running at the moment. And this is a project that we're really proud to be working with other museums across Cambridge in, and in which we're inviting people, members of the public, to create their own responses to some of our challenging museum objects. And what we as curators across the museums, we've made little films telling you about some of our objects. And Dan Pemberton has made one about the Hewn Diamond collection. And I'd recommend you go to the link and watch the films. They're really interesting. I'd encourage you to take part, but you can just go have a little look and watch the films. We're fairly sure that these are 19th century diamonds from Brazil, that slave labour was a major factor in that. And Dan in his film speculates around that, about what we know about that, but also what happens around diamond and mineral extraction today as well. So take a look at that. And then finally, I'm just going to show you 2 pictures. Just to sort of pull this together in a way. The first on the left is a picture by a Congolese artist called Sherry Samba, Reorganisation. It was a picture commissioned by the Royal Museum for Central Africa, which is, again, it's a Leopold connection. It was originally a museum he set up to sort of show off his colonial loot, and has recently undergone a sort of major decolonisation process. And I think this picture sort of says quite a lot. Central to it is a really quite degrading statue that was commissioned by Leopold that was on display in the museum. And you see it's being on the right, we have the Congolese community leaders, wanting to get it out of the museum. And on the left, we have the museum staff, not looking very fit and healthy. And the words watched over by Guido Grisels, who's the museum director. And the words that are in a number of languages there is that the staff are saying, we cannot accept the statue leaves the museum, it has made us what we are today. But to which the director replies, it's true and it's unfortunate, but we must completely rethink the museum. So the second picture is an intervention by Rob Theodore in our museum. He's done, and it was in response to the Black Lives Matter protests and activists, and it was shared on social media. And I think it's been, particularly since then, the power of statues has been very much in sort of public debate around the Colston statue and others in Bristol. And what I want to sort of show with these 2 pictures is that actually, whether it's a comprehensive restructuring, which the Royal Museum of Africa has done, or a series of smaller scale interventions, be they photographs, be they new labels, be they tours, be they digital resources, those smaller scale interventions, they're all important to signal our intentions and to validate the views of Black people and people of colour, people who've been systematically ignored and excluded from our work. And all those contributions, they contribute to a wider shift and a broadening in our perspectives and that aspiration to tell a much more complete and a fuller story. Oh, that's me. Thank you.